Hello, everybody, and welcome to another live stream episode of Adam's Music Box. I hope those who celebrated had a happy Thanksgiving because this particular episode is not going to be one of our happier ones. We're talking about a piece of artwork that is very heavy, very relevant, very transcendent, and at times very gut wrenching. And as we watch with horror on our social media feeds, because of course the fake media won't show it, we're witnessing what is about to be the slaughter of upwards of 1 million Christians, including many children, in the Levant and Syria in particular. We can only think of the anti war and ecumenical messages that are woven into the poetic and musical fabric of what some call a rock opera, what I prefer to just call a very important musical work of art. So the origins of Pink Floyd's The Wall really begin with Roger Waters seeking to, whether he knew it or not, take more artistic control over the band. As we all know, or at least as some of us know, when Sid Barrett had to leave the band because of his psychiatric problems, as some would define it, the band became something of a collective with Roger Waters on bass and vocals, Richard Wright on keyboards and occasional vocals, and Nick Mason on drums, working collaboratively with the new but familiar voice and guitar of David Gilmour. And the sort of collaborative phase of the band, but with Roger taking a role as the primary lyricist, reached a kind of peak with Dark Side of the Moon in 72. And they went from strength to strength to Wish You Were Here, another album where there was still a lot of collective musicality. On 1977's Animals, there were seeds of Roger taking more control. But by the end of the 70s, Roger said to the band, "Look, I've got two ideas. One is a story about hitchhiking and various personal experiences, and the other is this sort of grander, broader story about war and peace, the loss of parents, the loss of what we think is love, but might really just be lust and titillation, isolation from one's peers, isolation from other, just humanity in general because of the corruption of the music business, which is really an allegory for many kinds of businesses. There's a lot about the corruption of the medical profession, the legal profession, many professions, frankly. And the band looked at each other collectively and they said, "Let's do this one. Let's do The Wall." And what came out of it was Pink Floyd's most highly produced album ever. An album where, for the first time, apart from, the occasional backing vocalists or guest singers, it was an album that had other instrumentalists on the album apart from the four members of Pink Floyd. And many of them were quite well known in their own right. You had, for instance, Jeff Porcaro played drums on a track. Lee Ritenour, the great jazz fusion guitar player. You had Bruce Johnston from the Beach Boys leading a group of male backing vocalists, which was unique because prior to this, Pink Floyd had gone with female backing vocalists. But this time, a very different Beach Boys esque sound was used. And that was done musically intentionally because it created an atmosphere that contrasted sharply with the weighty, heavy, at times moribund, but at the same time quite empowering and invigorating lyrics of this album. Where the female backing vocals of the previous albums, albums like Dark Side of the Moon and Wish You Were Here, in particular, Animals didn't really have it. It added to sort of the musical texture and flavor and almost gave it a more ethereal sound, where the Beach Boys style backing vocals on The Wall created a sort of sunny, almost neo barbershop quartet type of sound, which contrasted with the heavy and dark nature of the album. Now, the story of the album is very much autobiographical for Roger Waters. He lost his grandfather in the Great War of 1914, the First World War. His father died before he really got to know him at Anzio in the Second World War. And this gave Roger a profoundly and pugnaciously anti war attitude that he carried with him for all of his life. There's an interview with Roger Waters in the early 80s. This was a bit after the war, with the great Jim Ladd, the DJ from KMET and KLOS in LA, but who had been syndicated and known all over the world. And he ended up becoming a very close friend with Roger around this time. And Roger talked about how the loss of both a grandfather and a father in back to back wars really it really shaped his entire perspective on life, on war, on family, on relations between human beings. And it gave him a lot of personal trauma, which he talked about working through. If anything, he's become more outspoken about his beliefs that were shaped by this event. And so the album revolves around a character called Pink, which is a send up on the fact that when the band first came to the States, a record industry man thought that one of the members of the band was called Pink, not knowing that Sid had named it for two obscure blues musician. I think it was Floyd Council and Pink something or another. The name escapes me. And so this character was left without a father during the war. He found himself rebellious as a schoolboy, rebelling against the strict but hypocritical leanings of his teachers, people who were abusive to the kids, and then went home and got abused by their overbearing wives. That was obviously portrayed very vividly in Another Brick in the Wall, parts one and two. And it's about maternal relations and how that might affect the male mind when there's no older male influence from a positive familial perspective to counterbalance it, and how one can get lost in the success of going out and being in a successful band. In this sense, it really is a tale of the boomer generation, where prosperity was much more readily available than in generations before and many generations since, but where an increasingly modern world that de-emphasized family and that broke families apart because of war allowed people to fill that void of soul, let's call it, or familiarity or affinity with the trappings of modern prosperity. But of course, it has many good sides, but it has many bad sides, such as drugs, alienation, tortured relationships between young men and young women in their 20s. And perhaps if we didn't divide families by war and by other things, the downsides of this tale of the boomer, if you will, the eternal boomer, wouldn't have those negatives. Again, the subtext of this story is so very rich. But on Pink goes to a successful career in music before he finds that the things that he was looking for to fill that familial void cannot satisfy him, even with the wealth of stardom. And he becomes increasingly withdrawn and decides to build a metaphorical wall between himself and his peers, between himself and society. And there are both positive and negative outcomes here too. The positive is that he's back in the womb, he's cocooned, but yet all of the problems that he had faced trying to find real connections were only magnified, and his descent into isolation led towards a descent into madness, made only worse by physicians who simply drugged him up to get him to the show rather than to actually recognize what was going on. And this is told brilliantly across the album seamlessly. There's no narration per se, it's all done through poetry and song. But the meaning, especially after a few listens, becomes incredibly clear. And the very evocative music tends to really match this story. Now, things reach a zenith when he takes on, in a delusional sort of fantasy, takes on the persona of a would be dictator. And this itself is a reflection of pop culture and about how maybe it isn't necessarily dictators that just grow up out of nowhere, but maybe a certain mentality among the group, among the herd, craves to be led this way. That, in other words, are the rock stars of the the 70s and 80s, the dictators of previous generations? Are the influencers today filling a similar role? The answer is, of course, sometimes yes and sometimes no. But in The Wall, Roger gives us a lot to think about in that respect. Eventually, he's brought on trial, where he's made to face both his internal demons and his tormentors. And the judge, in a final moment of lacking of any compassion, orders him to be exposed, and the wall is torn down. Now, of course, this was all played out not just musically and lyrically, but very much visually when they took it on a mini tour. They didn't have the wherewithal to take it on a massive tour because the stage set was semi permanent because of its elaborate nature. And so they only did it in a few cities. They did it in New York, they did it in LA, they did it in London, and they did it in Dortmund in West Germany. But they, of course, played multiple nights in a row in all of those cities. And during the concert, a physical wall was built between the band and the audience, which was a literal manifestation of the metaphorical wall that this lead character, this this semi-autobiographical character, was doing in terms of his psychological state. Now, the show is remembered as being one of the most impactful. Project film projections on 70 millimeter were shown on the wall with a lot of animation, including by the very much beloved animator Gerald Scarfe. There were life-size puppets, there were explosions, there were all sorts of interesting things. Unfortunately, we've never been able to see a full visual production of this show except in really low quality bootleg form. I don't know if this is because of the dislike between David Gilmour and Roger Waters, and this is tied up legally. Maybe someone doesn't want to release it. The audio's been released professionally and officially, but not the full visual. And Roger did once say that the entire show was filmed. He said in 70 millimeter, which would have been quite a production. I would have guessed they would have gone for 35, but even better if they actually filmed it in 70 millimeter. They did have the 70 millimeter projectors there to show the animation on the wall, which acted as a surrogate screen, if you will. But that is, of all of the things missing from the Pink Floyd archive, which they've released a lot of, that is sort of the prize, watching a video about that. Now, with all of that in mind, one should question whether the story is one of redemption or one of torture. At the end, Pink redeems himself by confessing that he wants to stop the show and the madness. I want to go home, take off this uniform, etc. But it also shows that the judicial system is just as flawed as the education system and as many other systems. Now, one of the things that Roger talks about, again, this is through the subtext, particularly in Goodbye Blue Sky, and the animation that went along with that makes this clear, is what he feels is the role of organized religion in failing to preserve the peace. Now, religious leaders in any faith can be and are deeply flawed, but I would argue that the message of Jesus Christ is, in fact, perfect, and that one could read, and I know Roger wouldn't necessarily want us to read into it this way because he himself is a religious, but one could see this entire allegory for what happens when society turns away from Christ. And when one does so, one is searching for meaning, one is searching for redemption, and one is searching for atonement and receiving none of it from the outlets through which it is being sought in the secular world. In other words, no redemption in drugs, in sex, in performance, no atonement possible before wicked judges. No meaning to be found in all of the pleasures that were available materially for that boomer generation. Obviously, we want some of those material pleasures back, but the point is, with or without them, some sort of spiritual grounding needs to come first. That, again, it's one interpretation, and it is admittedly, in the context of Pink Floyd, a heterodox interpretation. Roger Waters holds the view that religions are a source of division and contention. But obviously, a great work of art is great because it can be interpreted in many ways, including in unofficial interpretations. Now, The Wall, in spite of the fact that it was a 2 LP album, and at times it was more tedious because it was more layered and with more subtext than previous Pink Floyd albums, which sort of got to the point a bit quicker, it nevertheless became a top selling album and is remembered today as one of the finest albums of all time. Now, some of that is because of the music. There are songs that, even though it wasn't an album that was single friendly, quite a few of the songs actually made it onto Rock FM radio at the time, and many have in fact stayed as staples on FM radio. Think of Comfortably Numb, think of Hey You, think of Mother, think of Another Brick in the Wall Part 2. Those remain staples on what is now called classic rock radio. And of course, the music is very good. By this time, all of the members of the band were very good musicians, and Roger and David, as sort of the rivals at the front of the band, were they had really honed their craft. But I think that there are other reasons why The Wall has been and remains so beloved. Although Roger was telling a very specific, very personal, very autobiographical tale, it can be extrapolated to the feelings one has, the experiences one witnesses, and the catharsis and the yearnings, in inverted order, I suppose, that one goes through. This can be extrapolated to people from different generations, people who had different personal stories, people who aren't necessarily touched by war in a traditional sense, but who face conflict in their lives. Maybe it's living in an abusive home. Maybe it's going to a violent school. Maybe it's living in a violent city. And God knows there are plenty of those around these days because of the failings of what Roger would call the powers that be. And I think that just as The Dark Side of the Moon talks about the universal theme of madness and disassociation, The Wall, while touching on some of those same themes, is even a more specific story of coming of age. What does it mean? And I think Roger helped to make this meaning even clearer when he took it out on tour as a solo artist, beginning in, I think it was 2010. And he went that tour in its various legs and guises, went on for a very long time. When he did that, he both expanded and contracted the message simultaneously. He made it very clear through the additional animations, the additional stage work, and even a few additional songs that the wall of a mature Roger, as opposed to a young Roger, was about humanity's ability or inability to save itself from its more wicked urges, war being the most wicked one that he identified. And when he was plugging the tour, when he was advertising it in quite a few of the cities it was going to, he projected a quote by President Eisenhower. Um, Talking about how every battleship launched, every take made is fundamentally a theft from a child that longs to eat but goes hungry, a child that shivers in the cold. I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he was saying. Eisenhower, being a man widely regarded as a war hero and a great political leader, was warning that this obsession with a permanent warring state was essentially expending human resources on things that don't contribute to improving the human condition. And that quote really set the stage for this sort of revitalized version of the war that Roger took on tour. And when I say it was both larger and more specific, he was all the more open about the autobiographical nature of the story, which made it more specific, more narrow, more personal. But he was simultaneously widening it and making it about the wars that had only become more prevalent in the world since the late 1970s. Again, this was sort of when people were still talking about Iraq and Afghanistan. Julian Assange was mentioned very much in these productions, as was the modern police state, sometimes called the surveillance state. So it was very much something that he brought up to date and made incredibly relevant while preserving the essence of that original story that he wrote in the late 70s. And he even, I think this was around 2017 or so, maybe it was a bit earlier, but around then, sometime in the teens, as I suppose we have to call them, he released a film of the war, which in many ways is a much more cohesive narrative than the 1982 Pink Floyd's The Wall film that was released. I have a video specifically on the 82 film, so definitely if you're interested, you can go through the channel and check that out. But the more recent film he did really emphasizes this duality between the personal revelatory tale of Roger sort of psychoanalyzing himself and these broader messages of war versus peace, freedom versus slavery, conscience versus wickedness, all of these themes. And the concert, which is filmed in beautiful 4K, it's really an excellent, excellent production, especially if you get to listen to and watch it in a large surrounding, cinematic or otherwise. In addition to that, the film is intercut with scenes of Roger traveling across Europe to eventually go to Anzio, where he finds the spot where his father died. He also visits the gravesite of his grandfather who perished in the First World War, and it's very touching to see Roger there. He takes out his trumpet, plays the Lost Post memorial for the fallen members of his family. It's really incredibly touching. Now, war has always been part of the human condition, insofar as there is no God without the devil. Unfortunate but true. And I don't think war will ever go away, but there are certainly things that can be done by the human hand to minimize its instances, if you will. And right now is definitely not one of those moments, especially for the Christians in Syria, who, as I said at the beginning of this video, are facing the very real prospect of utter annihilation. It's really, really tragic. And we, as regular old civilians, when we see and read about the horror, we feel powerless. And sometimes listening to a piece of art, a piece of music like The Wall, helps us to feel less alone in our powerlessness. In other words, while we might be materially powerless, it makes us feel less hopeless and maybe even less helpless. There are voices to be raised in such circumstances. There are prayers to be said. There are thoughts to be thought over. And listening to a piece of music like this, ideally in its entirety from front to back, really really allows one to experience that kind of internal catharsis. And because of that, I do believe that it is one of the great works of art of all time, whether it's listened to as an album, seen as a stage work, as theater, seen in its one of its two cinematic versions. However you cut it, The Wall is something whose legacy I think will live on long after a lot of the music, good, bad, or otherwise, from its era is forgotten. Let me know what you think. As always, you can support this channel by buying a membership. Super chats are great ways to support it as well. And of course, the easiest thing to do is subscribe and like. Those things are free. And share it around with your friends and let us know what you think. Until next time, take care. Bye bye.